Hello, welcome to this tutorial. I'm Tom Foster and welcome to my world of pictures. It's a very exciting world, so if you can get hold of some kind of medicinal sedative, then you would be well advised to do so because it's going to be an absolutely thrilling ride from start to finish. Just looking at layouts today, how best to lay out a page and the panels therein in order to communicate the story as successfully and hopefully as dynamically as possible. As you can see, I'm working at breakneck speed here. This is speeded up to 4 times what the actual work rate was. Later we'll be going up to 6, so stay tuned for that, thrill seekers. As you can see, we've got 6 panels on this page. Well, you probably maybe can't see that just yet, but we've got sort of 6 major things going on anyway. We've got our first 2 panels where our 2 characters are just kind of mildly at odds with each other. Then we've got an establishing shot and a couple of panels, another couple of sort of close-up panels with the 2 characters, more aggressively approaching each other, and then finally we end with a sort of catharsis, one of the characters being roundly trounced by the other. Now, at this stage, this is just a sort of preliminary, what they would call a thumbnail drawing, and this can help invaluably to define the sort of process that evolves as the page comes together. Now, at this stage, I'm just blocking out the sort of major design elements, I suppose you would say. They're story elements, really, but for the purposes of laying out a page, the story elements become design elements. How do you get all the crucial information across in a way that fits together nicely on a page? So our crucial information in this case is largely figural, and where we've needed to bring the background into it, we have done. Panel 3 is our first sort of establishing shot, and our proper establishing shot, where we show as much of the background as we're going to need to know about for the purposes of this scene. And then our last panel shows our characters sort of interacting with that background in a fairly minor way, but a way that that helps to sell the story. It helps to give the events impact if they occur in some kind of obvious context and affect the things around them. Now, each of the story elements here in our 6 panels are being orchestrated very carefully in order to lead the reader's eye across the page in a certain way. Our first 2 panels here are not exactly static, but relatively kind of they're not over directed. That they're sort of a slight low angle or high angle, just to sort of sell the pose a little bit. So where in our first panel we've got our character sort of slightly rearing back a little bit or taken by surprise, we put the angle a little bit lower to suggest that further. In the second panel there, where we've got our other character kind of, you can't really see it in this little sketch, but he's sort of pointing accusingly at our primary character. I put the camera angle a little bit higher, just so that you can get the first to give them the sense that they're kind of leaning over menacingly, but also so that you can have the face and pointing hand all fitting quite nicely into one fairly tight column panel. And then we've got our establishing shot where we've eliminated the panel border altogether. That's quite a good thing to do with establishing shots because it allows you to get in a greater sense of context and scale for the background. Now this here is this is the sort of action line. This is the line that will hopefully guide, that will be the line that the reader sort of subconsciously follows as they look through the page. And here I'm just tweaking things a little bit so that they line up a little bit better. It is quite important to think in those terms. You don't always have to have one very clear line of action. It's not always possible. But in this case, for the purposes of this exercise, I thought it would be handy to have one that's fairly uh, fairly kind of straightforward, just a zigzag across the page that's very easy to follow. Notice the eye line of the characters is where the line is crossing. That's usually going to be the focal point of your panel. In this case, the line is, in fact, generally, if you're doing an action line like that, it will be to tie the focal points of all the panels together, and all the other elements in the panel should in some way serve the purpose of that as well. So now that we've got our panels roughly blocked out, we're moving into Daz Studio, which is a great piece of software if you haven't used it. It's usually free to download, and it comes with all your kind of tools that you'll need to light and stage your scenes. It comes with basic figures and everything as well, which are very good. This background I'm using here is one that I've purchased from the Daz website by a very good artist called Stonemason, and I think it's called The Back Streets, something along those lines anyway. And a lot of these backgrounds come with options to sort of pose elements of them, in this case opening the garage door. I've added a couple of boxes. I've got quite a good library now of things I've downloaded, little props and full scenes and everything. But the only thing I'm adding to this background is these three boxes, because later in the scene, that's the element with which our character is going to collide. So that's the only real element that's the positioning of it, and the fact that it's there is very important. I could have added some oil drums, some more oil drums or something, but boxes seem to be quite a good thing for a character to be colliding with, since that's such a sort of established thing. Plus, the boxes will show signs of impact, whereas an oil drum will just sort of bend out of the way unless the Hulk has been smacked into it. So now that we've got our background and a camera angle sort of roughly how we want it, which is all very simple, the camera tools and everything are all fairly intuitive. A couple of hours of playing around with Daz will allow you to get to grips with that pretty easily. We've brought in our characters now, and we're just first of all concentrating on the overall composition of the scene. Now we're starting, as you might notice, with our third panel on the page, which might not seem the most obvious thing to do, but starting with the establishing shot is usually a good idea, because it sort of cements where all the background elements are going to be placed in relation to the characters, and how our characters are going to be placed in relation to each other, which is something that will go on to inform the way that the action unfolds throughout the rest of the scene. Hopefully you can keep it relatively consistent, but obviously you'll probably want to play around a little bit with the physics of it in order to better facilitate your page layout. Now that we've posed the characters correctly in relation to the camera and to their environment, I'm going in and I'm posing them for their sort of secondary function, which is their attitudes and expressions. Given that this is a sort of a wide shot, the poses can be fairly sort of general. They don't have to be too specific. In fact, it's better if they're a little exaggerated, so that you can get the message across of what it is they're trying to sort of emote. One thing to bear in mind when you're posing your characters, trying to create relatively effective poses, is the character's center of gravity. So because I've got the top half of our character's body here leaning forward a little bit and pointing, then that would throw off their sense of balance in real life. So I'm going to have to go in a second here and adjust the legs accordingly. Another great thing about Daz Studio's Genesis models, which are the character models I'm using here, is that you can, as well as posing the limbs of the body and everything, you can also change the facial expressions. They have a whole range of facial expressions, basic ones that come as standard with the character, and you can download more for more sort of subtle or nuanced expressions. But one of the advantages is you can change the individual features of the face, the pose of those, or you can go for sort of preset poses which could be a specific emotion. Daz has all those kind of subcategorized for you. So it's very effective. Here I've put the camera at the eye level of the primary character in order that the secondary character is accurately looking at them and pointing at them. It's something that just, you know, it just helps if you're finding it difficult to eyeball exactly what the sort of line of sight should be on your character. Adding clothes to the character is not always massively important, since we're just using this for the purposes of proportion. But getting the belt line and things like the collar line and the armholes there, getting those established on your 3D model can be quite handy, because they can sometimes be difficult to plot onto a 3D model when it's in an unusual angle or seen from an unusual angle. Here, doing roughly the same thing with the female character, who's their sort of robotic character in the story. And you know, I play around here trying to get a top or something that's going to be right. But in the end, I just decide to go for the trousers, since that cements the belt line. I didn't really have anything in my library of wardrobe for the characters that was particularly similar to what I wanted in the design, so I just kind of abandoned that. Sometimes I might go in and download a piece of clothing specifically from the Daz website, but in this instance it doesn't matter too much, since our character is sort of a cyborg. Then, you know, there's not going to be a lot of clothing wrinkles and everything. Not that those tend to show up too well in 3D models. So as you can see, I'm opening and closing my Photoshop window as we go, just to compare the angle, the camera angle, and the position of the characters, because all of those elements have an important purpose compositionally in determining the flow of the page. So I've got to try and get it as close to the thumbnail as possible. Typically I would actually just do my thumbnails on paper, but it does have big advantages doing them in Photoshop, because you can compare so closely like this. Now I'm going in and I'm doing an initial render here, and this puts in our shadows. Now playing about with the figures again to get them as close to the thumbnail as possible. But these renders, the reason I end up doing quite so many is because the shadows in the scene, if you set your lighting to deep shadow map, then you get real-time shadows like that. And I want my shadows to fall in a certain way, because it helps to fill up any sort of dead space on the page and creates a sort of fuller, more well-rounded composition. It may seem like a minor thing, but it's something that, particularly in comics, you have to be very conscious of, because so much about page layout and composition of individual panels is about getting a good balance of black and white, and trying to make the panel seem sort of full and interesting without being cluttered. Here the shadows are going a little bit off to the side and not filling up those empty areas as much as I'd like them to. So I'm just playing around with that. Now, one thing that you'll notice happening a few times in the renders, and in fact in the one that I ultimately go for, is that this secondary character here, the one who's pointing, for some reason the Daz renderer has put a kind of green glow or sort of surface level sheen over the character's skin. Now, I've absolutely no idea why it does that. If anybody watching this tutorial has an idea of why that happens, then please do contact me on Twitter at JumbleCashback, JumbleCashback, because it's something I'd very much like to know. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this exercise, because or for the purposes of any of these renders, really, because we're just using them as a sort of combination between reference and something to sort of trace over to, just to get our basic proportions of everything, and some elements of our backgrounds that that are fairly geometric, and there's no reason to necessarily go in and hand draw individually. Moving on to panel 6 now, the last one on the page. Again, this one, because it's sort of an establishing shot, it's a good idea to do this one next, because it has our characters interacting with the environment, and the positioning of them within that environment is important to the composition of the panel. So again, I'm just sort of posing the character here, trying to get some idea of impact in the character's pose. Generally, everything wants to be sort of converging to the point of impact. So you don't want the limbs necessarily jutting out in a straight line, because that wouldn't appear natural. But everything should sort of suggest the direction in which the character has been sort of is kind of flying, albeit against their will. So everything should sort of point to or suggest that point of impact, which we'll be posing shortly. Again, this is where having the boxes being individually kind of manipulable comes into play. A lot of these backgrounds that you can purchase from Daz Studio do actually have background elements and props that you can pose individually, but it's worth checking that before you download it, because some backgrounds, everything will all just be locked in place and all be part of the same model, so you can't even turn on and off its or toggle its visibility. Whereas here, because I've specifically added these boxes to the scene, I knew that that wasn't going to be a problem. Artists like Stonemason tend to give you a fair few props to play around with and make the backgrounds as manipulable as possible, as you'll see shortly when I try and move the background sort of cyclone fence in order to frame our characters better. But yeah, you don't want to go and spend 20 quid on or $30 on a background if it's not going to service your needs. So always check the label, essentially, to see what the functions of it are, how many separate objects you get. But if a background doesn't suit your purposes, then you always have the primitives in Daz, which are, you can create primitive shapes in Daz Studio with just just in the free version. Actually, the pro version of Daz Studio is usually free as well, but just stuff that comes as standard with it. You can create cubes and cylinders and cones and everything, and those can always give you a very rudimentary background, which you can use just for the purposes of establishing your perspective and scale and everything. So you don't always have to spend a whole lot of money. Because I do this for a living, I tend to invest in backgrounds because it makes the job, I guess, a little bit easier, but it also just it gives me more to work with. You notice I've erased or turned off the visibility of some of those buildings in the background, just to give us a nice sort of clean, easy to follow composition. And plus, it means that there's less work to render those backgrounds when it comes to the inking stage. I tend to do all my layouts in Daz Studio first and Photoshop, then I'll print them out and do the pencils, and then I'll get a reproduction of those done, a blue line reproduction of those, and ink over the top of that, doing my pencils and inks traditionally. But there's lots of different ways to do it. You can just go straight from your Daz model to digital inks, which is what I'm going to do for this tutorial, just so I can record everything. And also, the page that we end up with at the end of this, that's sort of in the article in the magazine, it's not by any means a finished page, but it'll give you an idea roughly what a finished page might look like with so that it doesn't just look like a collection of 3D models that have been cobbled together. Although ideally, if you get your posing and your composition right and everything, it shouldn't really look like that anyway, or at least you'd have to kind of do a double take to notice that was it. Here I've encountered a little bit of a problem, because with that deep shadow map on the building which our character is landing in, is casting a lot of shadows over not only our foreground figure but our background figure as well. And while I want our foreground figure in silhouette for to give us a nice color, a nice black and white balance on the page, I do want some light to be falling on our primary character here, the one who's punching, in order to sort of pick them out and show them a little bit more clearly. Since they are kind of in the background, we don't want them to just fade in to the backdrop and become and not stand out, because they are performing quite a sort of dramatic action here. So we want to highlight that a little bit. Now I play around a little bit here with trying to achieve that with just one light source, but in the end it's often quicker to just put in a secondary light source, a little spotlight. The light I'm using for most of this scene is what's called a distant light, which again is something that just comes with Daz Studio as standard, as do the spotlights. Distant light works kind of like the sun. You know, it illuminates your whole scene and an environment from one clear direction. A spotlight works very much like a spotlight does in real life, in that it has a small cone of a spread angle that will encompass a small kind of cone, and no more than that. You can alter how much of an area it does cover, but it's a lot more limited in those terms. Although the further you put it from the thing you want it to light, the wider the spread angle, spread area becomes, because obviously it tapers towards the light source. So the further from the light source you get, the stronger the light is. I say the stronger it is, the more broad the area covers is. And this is a bit more like what I want, although I still want a slightly stronger shadow on that figure. Or maybe I don't. Maybe I do actually save it here. I think I moved that spotlight a little bit more just to get a slightly stronger shadow on our background figure. Incidentally, apologies if the video and sound quality on this particular tutorial is maybe not what you're used to. I have had a little bit of faffing around with the settings and stuff, so the video quality may not be absolutely fantastic, but you should be able to get all the basic ideas across. It's not like you're having to see any particularly fine line work here or anything. So this is panel 2 now. We've gone to panel 2 next because even though it doesn't involve a direct interaction with our background elements, it does establish that there's sort of junk and stuff behind our secondary character who's ultimately going to get batted into it. In panel, doing the composition for panel 1, you'll notice with those boxes and everything, even though I had quite a strong shadow falling on the elements inside the garage area, I did make sure that the boxes were not entirely in shadow, and were sort of placed in such a position as to tie in with the rest of the major compositional elements of the scene, and to sort of be tangential from our line of action that we're using. Now, there's a very important reason for that, which is that when you've got an element in your background that the character is going to be interacting with directly, you want to foreshadow it typically by showing it in one of the earlier panels. It's not so much because it's not necessarily any easier to follow on a conscious level for the reader, but it can be sort of it can be harder to follow if a character suddenly interacts with an element that you had no idea was in a scene. You'll see that in filmmaking as well. Usually, if there's going to be something which which comes into play later in a scene, it will be established before it's provided there is an earlier establishing shot in the scene. It'll usually be established earlier on, just so it doesn't seem like the filmmaker's kind of making it up as they're going along. That it's clear that everything has been planned out in advance and has a purpose. It's just one of those little subtle storytelling rules. Talking of film, in fact, there are kind of two schools of thought on how you put your page compositions together, and there is the idea that everything should be very closely related to sort of just what comes out of your head in that initial thumbnail, because it really sells an overall composition of the scene. And the other is when you're working with 3D tools like this, you can of course go in and find compositions and camera angles that work that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of right away. That can work quite effectively sometimes, and I mean, the reason I talk about filmmaking is because a long time ago now, I watched a documentary on the film, making of the film Taxi Driver, and Martin Scorsese talks about how he can't quite explain why it's important not to do detailed storyboards when planning your shoot, because well, he doesn't actually explain the reason for it. Really, he just says that he never does detailed storyboards, and it's sort of important not to. I think because you can get very caught up in your initial idea of what you want a scene to look like, and have no part of the process left to kind of discovery. Whereas, you know, when you have either a virtual environment like this or a live action environment, once you've got your camera and your actors and all your props and you know, your location or set up, you may want to kind of, you may find an interesting composition, or you know, something that's more visually striking than what you could have ever just imagined up out of your own head. The problem is when you're doing that with comics, because you're not just dealing with one image at a time, they still all have to tie together to make a page. So the question becomes: do you go into Daz Studio determined to, or Poser? That's one of the other, you know, softwares that's similar to this, pieces of software. Do you go in with a very clear idea of what you want and try to mimic that as exactly as possible in order to facilitate your initial layout idea? Or do you go in, play around, try and find individual compositions that work nicely with a sort of mind to putting them together on a page, but leaving a certain amount of work left to do in Photoshop to try and place all those images together in a way that works? The second method of finding compositions as you go along does tend to be more time consuming towards the end of the process, and it can result in, particularly if you've got a deadline to meet, it can result in sort of last minute panic of realizing that you suddenly have, you know, 6 panels that you like and don't want to lose any sort of real detail from, but then they don't fit together on a page, and that's not a good thing to happen. There are ways around it, but it can lead to kind of awkward page layouts. The best thing to do in that situation, usually, if you have already found yourself in that situation, is to open up Daz again and just sort of tweak your layout a little bit so that it fits together better on the page. Sometimes you can kind of contrive a solution just in Photoshop that can end up being, you know, just sort of by accident end up being more dynamic than what you planned. But it's less predictable, and if you're working to a schedule, it's not necessarily to be recommended. In this case, because I'm working very, very closely to the initial thumbnail, now moving on to the action panels and just sort of posing the characters appropriately. There's not too much to talk about when doing these closer up panels, because they're very much just a case of trying to replicate the initial pose I've set out to achieve. I'm changing the light and conditions slightly just so that, you know, we don't have quite so much of the character in shadow. There's an awful lot of the character in shadow here, and I don't want as much of it to be in shadow, because I want to have more of the facial details clearly. You know, I want to be able to draw into those a bit more. I mean, it can be very dramatic to have a lot of the figure in shadow, but the more the figure is in shadow, often the more clear it is that you've worked from a 3D model. Whereas sometimes if you like the character a little bit more evenly, your individual drawing style comes out a little bit more, because you get to work in a bit more detail in the face and things. Here I'm sort of trying to resolve an issue of tangents. I don't want my shoulder to be coming out at a tangent to the head, because it might sort of read like a kind of a weird growth coming out of the character's temple. So I'm trying to find a way to make it clear that it's you know, a separate part of the anatomy. Again, it seems like a fairly minor thing, but it's all part of the kind of the language of visual storytelling, if you want to put it in those terms. Again, just trying to replicate the pose. One nice little sort of tip for Daz Studio is that when it comes to lighting your scenes, if you're using a spotlight, you'll notice that at the top of the sort of active viewport there, the one that I'm using to that I can see my characters in, there's a little sort of drop-down menu on the top right-hand side, and that tells me what camera I'm looking through. And you can set up various cameras all over the place. Usually a good idea to set up a camera quite quickly, because the perspective view that is the default won't necessarily stay anchored if you have to close and reopen your file. So you may find yourself losing the camera angle that you worked so hard to get. So always try and put in a specific static camera, which you could do just going to the sort of drop down menu. But yeah, the drop down menu that was in the viewport there that I was talking about just allows me to look through the various cameras that I have, but it also allows me to look through the lights as if they were a camera. So it allows you to judge exactly where your light is pointing. Now I've moved my 3D renders into Photoshop, and I'm just doing a very sort of simple process here using the stamp tool, and usually I use the stamp tool 2 times on the image. I'll keep the image as is on one layer. Then I'll create a second layer, a duplicate second layer, and a duplicate third layer. The third layer, I will use the stamp tool on a very low black and white balance, so I'm getting a lot of the detail preserved. As you can see in this establishing shot, it has preserved a lot of the individual details, even the kind of pavement slabs and everything, and that's good for getting the best understanding of what all the individual elements in your scene are. And I'll do a second pass on a lower, just a grey with a higher black and white balance, so I get an idea of where my kind of dramatic shadows are going to be. And I'll just multiply those layers so I can see them all at the same time. Yeah, well, the one thing you'll notice is that when you import your Daz renders into Photoshop and apply a filter, particularly something like the stamp filter, they can be very kind of the resolution be very low, because the resolution of your Daz renders will usually be quite low, about 96 dpi or something. Whereas when I import them into Photoshop, I up the DPI to about 600, just because it means that I can then apply the stamp tool and get lots of detail in there, which I'll later go on to use in my pencils and my inks. It does make for quite big files, but you can always lower the resolution once you've got your once you've applied the stamp tool. You can always just bring it back down to, say, 300 or something, and it won't get rid of much of the detail. But those filter tools tend to work better if you've got a higher what's the word, pixel count. So I'm doing the same process here with all 6 panels, just going in, getting my very basic outline layer, and then getting another layer that's the shadow, that forms the shadows. I guess not too much to say about this process, other than I'm just trying to match my renders up to the initial thumbnail and the line of action as closely as possible. And it seems to be working quite well, because I've kept a very close eye while working on those Daz renders, because I've kept a very close eye on where everything's going. and how everything's angled so that it matches as closely as possible to the thumbnail. The process of going in and arranging them on the page has been fairly straightforward. You really want to keep as close an eye on that as possible, because even a slight change in angle can make all the difference, and you'll find yourself struggling to fit the elements together effectively. I've been very kind of stringent in observing that this time around. Now, at some point in the recording of this audio, I'm going to have to make an edit, because my recording software will only allow me to record for about 50 minutes or an hour before it stops automatically, and this tutorial does go on for a little bit longer than that. So I think since we're doing something that's fairly self-explanatory now in the page, I might just go and make that edit right now. So bear with me. I'll be back in a second. I'm back. So welcome again to this this tutorial. Now, I'm just going in and cropping out the backgrounds here of my renders to get them to fit into panels. But a piece of advice that I would give you if you're planning on composing your pages this way, using sort of prefab renders from Daz, don't have a spare copy of your renders in your page once you've done them. I duplicated the layers that those panels were on quite quickly because you may realize at some point during the process that something needs nudged a little bit or moved around a little bit, and you may have cropped out that detail already. So having another copy of that layer handy that has been uncropped can just be very, very useful. I mean, it's not the end of the world, because presumably you'll have a separate file where that render is still fully intact from your original work on it before you imported it into your layout page. But it's just a time saver, really, more than anything else. In this instance, I'm sort of there isn't too much problem with that, because I've stuck so closely to what we started out with, which really demonstrates the value of having that initial thumbnail. It only takes, I would say it only takes a couple of minutes to do a good thumbnail, but actually a good thumbnail might take you a little bit longer, because there are always problems to be solved in any composition. Speaking of which, before I started recording this, I asked the public at large, or at least people I know on Facebook, if they had any questions about composition and page layouts and things that I could maybe answer on this commentary to give us something additional to talk about. And whenever I ask for those types of things, the answers can vary in their sincerity, or the questions can vary in their sincerity. In this instance, it's quite a straightforward question, which is that Bobby Mingus, or Menzies, I assume it's Mingus, apologies if I'm pronouncing it wrong, asked, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the question in front of me, but he was asking, after countless different pages and panels by so many artists over the years, how does an artist still create a page that looks individualistic? It doesn't just look like an exact replica of something someone else has done. The answer to that is actually not through any great virtue on the part of the artist. Usually the answer is simply that there are so many problems to be solved and challenges during the course of putting a page together, that the solution to those problems is rarely, if ever, the same. In this instance, we've got 6 panels on the page, all delivering specific story beats and pieces of information. about our characters and everything, each with a different kind of in each one our character has a different set of motivations and is in a specific environment and everything. So with all those elements at play, the odds of ever having two page layouts be exactly the same is are pretty slim. I mean, you do tend to get influenced by other people's ways of laying out a page. If you've seen a type of page layout that works particularly well, or you believe works particularly well, and you think would go well with your sort of style, then you may sort of subconsciously or consciously emulate that page layout. But because the story that you're trying to tell will undoubtedly be different in some way and have different elements in it, then just naturally different little compositions and things will occur within your panels. Even if you're using a very straightforward grid system, the kind of old school way of laying out a comic book page where you would have 6 or 9 panels all of equal size sitting together on a page in a very sort of straightforward window-like fashion. Even in that case, every panel would be of something different. Every panel would have decisions in it as to whether it was a close-up or a medium shot, and from what angle those shots were shot, if you like. So you would get a different page, a different layout for. I mean, if you look at something like Watchmen, most of the pages in Watchmen conform to a fairly kind of standard grid system, often the same one for most pages, but because each panel is telling a different element of the story, and each panel is a different picture, none of those pages actually look the same. But there are there are competing schools of thought on what is the best way to put your pages together. I mean, some writers and artists do prefer that very straightforward grid system because it allows for a very specific type of pacing in storytelling, which is very easy to follow, very natural to read, and it does work quite nicely for narrative purposes. It's very immersive. From the kind of writer's point of view, or from the story point of view, it can be very immersive. Whereas artists will quite often prefer to have a very dynamic, sort of dramatic page layout that highlights highlights the art elements, and for each page is kind of an artwork unto itself, just through virtue of how it's been laid out, and how exciting that is. I think the ideal lies somewhere in between, or maybe defaulting actually to tending towards the more traditional way of doing it, just because as much as you may want to highlight the drama and everything in your artwork, that's only going to get somebody buying one issue of the comic, really. Whereas if you've got, and it's also, when somebody's reading a story, like when I buy a graphic novel or a comic, I'll usually buy it for the artwork more than anything else, because that's my particular area of interest. And if I'm looking at artwork that's very excitingly laid out from one page to another, I'll often look into those pages a great deal and study them, but I'll find myself not really reading the story. Whereas if I pick up an Asterix book or something, which does, I mean, the Asterix books do tend to have very beautiful artwork, but it all serves to tell the story. I'll find myself far more drawn into the story, and I think ultimately that's probably more important in comic book terms, is that the storytelling remains strong, no matter how dramatic your layouts are. I mean, ultimately, it's a question of personal preference, but you should still be able to lay out a page fairly traditionally and tell the story that way, because that might be what the writer wants, that might be what the editor wants, That might be that might just be the best way to tell the story in some cases. You know, if you're dealing with a scene that's quite sort of not necessarily slowly paced, but quite measured in its pace, then a grid system can be very effective. Um, it's sort of like a dialogue scene in a film or whatever. You won't necessarily have too many really dramatic angles or anything. Stuff might play out in a quite sort of proscenium style, but that often works. It can be very immersive, and it really helps you follow the story. Whereas if you have a dialogue scene with the cameras moving around every 5 seconds, then it it can it can create a sense of, sort of not disorientation exactly. It's maybe a little dramatic, but it can create a sense of unease, mild unease in the viewer, which doesn't help. It's good to have It's good to have breaks in the action, both directorially and in story terms. And your writer will probably be observing that. You know, the story is not just going to consist usually of fight scenes from start to finish. And if it does, then there'll probably be moments in there of kind of that are kind of character studies more than they are, exposes of action. Um, so having a being able to do a more kind of measured and straightforward directing style in your artwork uh, will often serve the story as well. You don't have to do it all the time, and you should try and work on an approach that I think that's somewhere in between. Like if you go from having layouts that like sort of Watchmen style layouts which are all on a grid on one page, to then suddenly having kind of like a Marvel title, a current Marvel title where that doesn't have always particularly traditional page layouts. That's like a I was going to say David Finch page, but his layouts aren't always that kind of scatterbrained. They're not scatterbrained at all. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say about an artist who's considerably more accomplished than I am. But there are a lot of times in page layouts in comics that deal very heavily with action that will be very kind of dramatic. But it's easy to get tempted into thinking that you should have that every page should look like that. That if you've got a dialogue scene or whatever, that it should look like an action scene, but it shouldn't. It's not an action scene, and if you try and make it look like an action scene, then it means that there's probably going to be one tone in the whole of your storytelling, which isn't good. There should be peaks and gullies. There should be, like you wouldn't. A film would be boring if it was just action from start to finish. There's got to be moments of kind of quiet repose and characterful moments, and because that helps the drama. Otherwise, it's not grounded in anything. Now, one of the reasons why I'm talking in more general terms at the moment, rather than specifically speaking about what's going on screen, is that at the moment I'm doing a process which isn't really integral to the layout process. It's not something I would typically do in Photoshop. This is I would have printed out the page by now and started to work into it in pencil. But the reason I'm not doing that is because I want to give a relatively strong idea of what the finished page might look like in some terms anyway. So I'm just going in and kind of adding a little bit of more nuanced, detailed stuff that helps sell the characters and gives them their appropriate costumery and everything. If you're drawing established characters, you probably won't find a Daz model that perfectly meets your needs, because obviously those characters are copyrighted and everything. So you will have to probably improvise to some extent, and have some understanding of how clothing and form works. You always have to have an understanding of how form works. Just because you're using a 3D model to pose your figure doesn't mean that you don't have to know how to draw figures. In fact, if anything, if you're using 3D models, in some ways your knowledge of anatomy and particularly facial anatomy has to be stronger, because it has to be commensurate with the accuracy that's afforded to you by the 3D software. You can't use the 3D software to get very, very accurate proportions on your characters and then suddenly render them really terribly, because it will look awful. If you've got a more kind of stylistic or cartoony style to your artwork, then this process is probably going to be, if you use it for anything, it would just be purely for reference. You would never work into a 3D model the way that I'm doing here. I happen to work in a style which is sort of aims at some kind of realism, so it doesn't hurt the drawing too much to have it based on a 3D model. Although typically I will go in and I will change things. Like in this instance, I'm not bothering too much with it, because this is just a sort of demonstration of layout and composition. But I would pretty much completely redraw those hands and the face. I might use the proportions of them as a very rough guide, but particularly the hands and face on a 3D model are the most telling areas, because they're the most expressive areas on the real human body, and most kind of complicated in terms of how many bones they have. Well, the head doesn't have a huge amount of bones, obviously, but the hands certainly do, and the head's got a lot of different muscles, and it's a complicated shape, more complicated than it might appear at first glance. So using your 3D models is very much something that you should do with some caution, and always balance it out with solid drawing skills. It's very much the same as using photo reference in some ways, although the advantage of using 3D models as opposed to photo reference is that you can still stick very truly to an initial thumbnail sketch. You can go in to Daz with and come out of it with something that's very, very close to your kind of initial artistic vision, if you like. It's just that it's more slightly more kind of accurate to real life proportions and everything than you might get from an initial sort of doodle. But in terms of faces and more expressive and artistic elements, it very much behooves the artist to have as strong an understanding of those as possible, because otherwise it will just look like you've taken a 3D model and run it through Photoshop. In regard to photo reference, I would still recommend using photo reference of some kind, particularly in regard to your faces and your hands and everything, because Daz is only good for so much, and you can't learn. I mean, you can learn some stuff about anatomy from your Daz models, but you're never going to learn as much from a 3D model of a body as you will from a real live one, because there's so much detail and nuance to the way that the muscles work and move everything that at this stage anyway, for a posing software like that, it can't emulate it exactly. It's rigged in a specific way as a 3D model that doesn't account for the movement of every individual muscle and everything. And that's, as I say, particularly in places like evident in places like the face and the neck and the hands, where so many kind of tendons and so much cartilage and everything is on display, that if your face and hands are in a different position, then the skin and the musculature on them will contort in a very specific way. So studying light from life and photo references is absolutely important. They're just adding a little bit of detail on the boxes to show the impact of the figure, which again was something that we considered at the formative stages of this page. It does help to think about these things in advance, because it it saves you time and effort at the penciling stage. I've done a very kind of rudimentary design on this robot character, or sort of cyborg character, just to give you an idea. Now here I'm bringing out the boundaries of that establishing shot without adding any extra detail. I'm just building on the black areas, or creating little black areas to allow me to expand that panel, and that just helps to fill up the page a little bit more, create less dead space on the page, and have a nicer balance of black and white. Picking out a little bit of the contour of that figure there, because again, too much black is as bad as too much white, which, God, sounds terrible if it were to be applied to social politics. But on a page layout, that certainly is the case. If you have the big dense areas of one or the other, then you can it can look very two-dimensional. So just picking out little areas like that, having the light just kind of curve around the contour of the back of our secondary figure there, just helps to break up that black area a little bit, without appearing like I've just put a white outline around stuff. So it still seems fairly realistic and fairly true to the lighting conditions. This is where I'm going in and sort of attempting to kind of redraw the hands a bit in Photoshop, but I am doing a bit of a rush job in it, because it's not really the purpose of this tutorial. I just wanted something that didn't look entirely terrible to go in the magazine. These impact lines here, or sort of starburst, sunburst lines, they're all kind of geared towards the focal point of our image to some extent, and you may see me go in and try and tie those in more closely to the line of sort of sight across the page. I think ultimately I end up abandoning them in this panel in favour of a different type of effect, just because as much as the graphics tablet and everything is good for some things, unless you're working in Manga Studio, which has tools specifically designed for creating nice lines and everything, or even, you can get them from Photoshop I think as well, but I prefer to do that kind of thing practically, because I think interesting lines have to have some kind of imperfections in them. I said this on another tutorial that I've done as well, but I find that when I'm working practically, my goal is to emulate as closely as possible a kind of mechanical process with my lines. When I'm working with a brush, I'll try and achieve as even a line weight as possible and as crisp and clean a line as possible. Whereas when I'm working in the computer, I almost want the opposite, because when working in real life, every line and that you draw will have its own inherent imperfections, whether it's just because of the grain on the page, albeit virtually indistinguishable, or the fact that you're working in ink, which is not a it's a messy medium. It's not one that will behave itself completely. Whereas when you're working on the computer, unless you have special brush presets and everything, which I don't tend to like, because it tends to be quite obvious that that's what you've used. When you're working on the computer, lines will tend to be almost too mechanical looking, so I'll have to go in and make them a bit more ragged and everything. So I don't tend to like doing line work really in a computer, particularly when I'm trying to give the look of a kind of finished page. So here I'm just kind of going for more impressions than anything else. You'll notice I've broken the panel border on that fourth panel. Again, that's just to allow our character kind of pop out of the panel a little bit, and to break up a little bit of the dead space on the page. I chose to do that rather than pushing those two kind of horizontal panels up a bit to meet with the first two panels, because I wanted to give that third panel a little bit more space on the page, and I thought that a nice compromise would be to have those panels pushed down a little bit, but to break the panel border on that fourth one. Because this is, that gives you a nice little suggestion that that character is the dominant one of the two. A little bit of foreshadowing for the fact that ultimately that is the character that ends up seemingly winning this exchange. Although I did still want to suggest through the size of those two panels that that they were in some way maybe ostensibly evenly matched. You'll notice I've kind of staggered those panels a little bit. Put one, put them in a kind of stepping stone type. One leading diagonally down into the other, and that again is just part of leading the eye across the page in accordance with that that red line that we drew across the page. I keep saying we. I feel like that's more inclusive. But you didn't do any of it. I did it all. So sorry about that. I don't know what's the best. Well, I know I was supposed to write the article in the first person, but speaking in the royal we does seem a little bit either slightly psychologically awkward or very kind of grandiose. That's just what I've done. So apologies if that jarred with you at any point. And I've probably kind of vacillated between using we and I, which again was just an attempt to be sort of more inclusive. Here I am kind of giving more kind of impact lines and everything. I think I maybe say we when I'm talking past tense. So that line that we drew, but then when I'm commenting on something that I'm doing in real time on the screen, I'll say I. Anyway, none of that is important or relevant to this tutorial. I played about with the idea of not having that character break the panel border, but having their head be kind of cropped by the panel border like that just seemed a little bit too forced. And in a way, it does seem a little bit forced on that fifth panel. The character does seem a little bit too squeezed into the box, even though that is a 3D model. It's not that I've contrived it in such a way that's unnatural, that it would fit into such a space. But the way that the head is cropped and stuff maybe isn't ideal. So even within this exercise that's purely about panel layout, I have made some kind of little mistakes and things that don't look fantastic, but I think the overall thing does still serve to illustrate the point. One of the other little maybe mistakes that I've made is that I've made the box that is the upper box on that last panel a little bit too tangential to the hand in the panel above it. That might be fixed by having a more clear panel border. You can see that I've used white to just kind of bring out the panel border a little bit on those panels that are set against black. And maybe if I'd done that at that point, that would actually have worked. But you kind of want to avoid unrelated tangents and stuff, much as I was saying about the shoulder appearing like it was kind of growing out of the head. You want to avoid stuff that appears to be kind of colliding with or emanating from another object that is in fact not related to it or is behind it or whatever. Try and have everything composed in such a way where every object is clearly distinct. Like for example with that lamppost in the bottom panel, I moved it so that it was not completely in the same place as the end of the kind of gate of the fence, because I didn't want it to appear that, because it was in silhouette particularly, I didn't want it to appear that the lamppost and the fence were all one thing, that somehow the lamppost was part of the fence. But just moving it to the side a little bit meant that I could clearly distinguish them. Again, may sound like something that's not that important, but it actually does make quite often does make a big difference to the impact of your page and to how kind of schooled and professional it looks, just observing those little touches. I don't know, am I going to go in here and put a little white fringe around that bit of the panel border? I don't know if I am. I've forgotten. This will be exciting. I don't think I am. That's a shame. But yeah, like I say, this is a roller coaster ride of a video, so things like that do happen. These background effects and stuff are all very impressionistic, and that sometimes works in a comic book page. It helps save time. Ideally, though, maybe what I should have done with that fifth panel would be to have action lines that follow the perspective of the background, because somewhere I'll still have that original render. I think I may have rendered it without the background actually. But if you render it with the background, then you get a sense of what the kind of perspective grid on your background look like, where the vanishing point is. And I could have had action lines going from the vanishing point to and branching out towards the foreground. That would have been nice and effective. Oh well, never mind. Now see there where I did that effect with that sort of cloudy effect in this panel here. I deliberately brought it forward a little bit from where the sort of edge of the door is in the bottom panel, because again, trying to avoid tangents, trying to avoid images merging together that are supposed to be separate images. Anyway, we're coming to the end now, so I better wrap it up. Thanks very much for joining me for this tutorial on layouts. Hopefully it's been of some use to you, and I'll speak to you next time I'm doing one. Thanks very much. Goodbye.